Hello, Scott and Mikhail. Hello, everyone who will watch this video. It's a pleasure to welcome you all to this new series of Scholar-Practioner debates that we are starting at Workties. The goal of this series is to create an open arena for discussions of scholars and practitioners to help scholars better understand how practitioners see or use their work, and help practitioners to get the topical and evidence-based answers to their pressing questions without need to squeeze their way through jungles of 40-page scholarly papers spread across hundreds of journals. Luckily, we have amazing panelists today. They represent two different but interdependent worlds, academia and industry. And they both appreciate the importance of scholar-practitioners dialogue, so they are perfect for our first debate in this series. Scott Tannenbaum is the president of the Group for Organizational Effectiveness, a consultant firm that has worked with over 600 organizations, including more than 75 Fortune and Global 1000 companies. He's an expert in organizational development, team effectiveness, and change management. His latest book, Teams That Work, offers evidence-based advice for leaders and consultants alike. Thank you for joining us, Scott.
Thanks, Roman.
Mikhail Wolfson is an associate professor and Vernon Smith Fellow in Management at the University of Kentucky. His research spans team composition, informal learning, and network analysis. He has conducted studies across industries like healthcare, professional sports, and the military. Wow, such a diverse set of industries. Welcome, Mikhail. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me, Roman.
So our goal for this debate today is to explore informal learning, whether it boosts performance, whether it's a competitor for formal learning and training, what makes it helpful or not helpful, who can benefit from it. So with great pleasure, I will learn Mikhail's and Scott's thoughts on the topic, and we will also address the practical questions that we have received before the event on LinkedIn. Scott, let's begin with you. Your expertise comes not only from running your own company, but also from consulting many different organizations, right? So what's your perspective on informal learning? What's your experience? What is it? Why should organizations care about it at all? And does it maybe successfully exist within your organization or at your clients' organizations?
Just very practically, informal learning is all the learning that takes place outside of formal, structured learning environments. You know, every day at work, we're all learning by doing things. We're all learning by reflecting on our work. We're all seeing other people do things well and not well. We get the chance to talk to people. Sometimes we absorb things they're telling us. And we're getting feedback both from the work we're doing and maybe from some of the people we're working with, our bosses, our coworkers. So one thing we know is that most of the learning that takes place during our careers doesn't happen in formal settings. It doesn't happen in classrooms and in training rooms. That's partly why it's important. And I think it's becoming even more important as work has become more dynamic. So if on a day-to-day basis, I'm being asked to deal with different tasks and different people, and different priorities, it makes it very difficult to plan in advance all the formal learning experiences that I might need, particularly around emergent sorts of things, which is why I think it's increasing in importance. And yet one thing I've noticed is that despite the prevalence of it and the importance of it, organizations spend almost all their time and all their money focused on formal learning.
Thank you so much. And Mikhail, you have spent many years exploring informal learning in different industries. So I would love to learn from you. Is there any scholarly evidence for what Scott has shared? Does it fit the findings of your research or something that you experienced?
It's funny. My opening was going to be basically the same thing, but with a couple of numbers. So in the United States, organizations spend upwards of $200 billion with a B on formal training and development. That number's on the rise. I think the first project we did, it was at around 160 billion. Just 4 years later, it's up to 200 billion, and that number is already a couple years out of date. To Scott's point, estimates range from anywhere from 70 to 90% of learning happens outside of that formal training and development. And so if we're spending all of our money on formal training and development, we're kind of focusing on this 10 to 30% bucket. Now, that doesn't mean they don't overlap, and it doesn't mean they don't help each other in terms of formal and informal learning, and I'm sure we'll get into that in a little bit. But maybe there's an opportunity for us to think about, rather than focusing on formal training and development, can we make people better learners so they can engage in some of this informal learning to better help themselves and their colleagues? Does it work? So the short answer is generally yes. So there is general positive evidence that supports that informal learning is advantageous, but it gets a lot more nuanced in terms of who is it that engages in this learning, what kind of learning they're actually doing, and what kind of context are they doing it in. I think Scott raises a great point about how we constantly have it. We're living in a changing world. If you think about just some of the developments recently with generative AI and all these other developments, our environments are becoming more dynamic. And the likelihood that we will have fully packaged, shiny PowerPoints to teach us how to do everything is diminishing over time. And so we need to figure out how to make our learners more adaptive. And one of the nice things about informal learning is I think it can be one of those valuable tools that allows individuals to adapt, probably with some safeguards in place.
Okay, so let's jump to the very, very meat of it and try to answer the questions that we have collected from LinkedIn before this debate. We get quite a lot of questions about measurability of informal learning. As it is informal, how we can connect it with our KPIs? How can we understand if it works at all and impact performance or other outcomes? How can we make sure that employees' informal learning is something relevant to the organizational needs and not just like they are plotting against the organization or something?
I like this nefarious approach that you're planning here.
So, something that happens out of control may imply some fears, right? So, Scott, from a practical perspective, how do you help organizations measure the impact of something as intangible as informal learning?
So first, I'd say if I'm wearing my researcher hat, I'm very, very interested in measurement. When I wear my practice hat, at one level, I really do care about measurement because, look, we tend to focus on the things that we measure, particularly decision makers. But I also want to be really clear here that not everything can and should be measured. Right? Informal learning is much more difficult to evaluate than formal training, in part because it tends to occur spontaneously in many cases, because it's very idiosyncratic, because there's not a preset start and end time. It's more ongoing in nature. And in the case of training, you've got these preset learning objectives that you can build measures around. But that's not how informal learning works. So when I think about measurement of informal learning, really from a practical perspective, I like to think about the difference between behaviors, conditions, and outcomes. So behaviors are people engaging in informal learning? And we can get information on that. That's definitely measurable. I think the conditions piece is really interesting too. This is, are we enabling informal learning to flourish? And as Mikhail intimated, in a good way, right? Like, are they focusing on the right things around this? And outcomes is, are people learning, and is it positively affecting the organization? So I think on the condition side, companies can and should be assessing whether employees are getting ample opportunities to engage in informal learning, whether they're interacting with experts and others with deep knowledge enough, whether they're getting the chance to experiment and reflect, do they have the time to do this? Are they getting the chance to huddle up with people that they work with to kind of think through the work that they've been doing? We can also assess whether people are getting ample support, right? From team leaders, from their peers. Are they being encouraged? Are they given that? I think Mikhail used the word guardrails earlier. Are they given the right guardrails around this? These things I think are all very measurable. And we do know that when people engage in informal learning and they see these opportunities, that is positively related to employee engagement and retention. So even without the learning outcomes, we know there's benefits if we're doing this properly. I'll just say a quick word about the outcomes on this is that, I think we can capture insights about the types of things that our employees are learning informally. We've done some of this sort of things. We get critical incidents and examples, and also get a sense of where they wish they were learning more. So it becomes almost a needs analysis type of measurement around this. But it's really, really difficult, if not impossible, to employ kind of the classic training evaluation designs that we might use around a very preset training program. And it's a bit harder to attribute kind of growth to specific informal learning experiences.
So correct me if I'm getting you right. If I'm getting you not right. So you suggest that organizations should focus on the process of informal learning, not on these outcomes. And we believe that it would contribute to such important outcomes as engagement and retention.
Yeah, I would say if we're talking about the measurement aspects of this, right, we probably get more useful information, more actionable information by focusing on whether people are engaging in the behaviors, whether we're creating the conditions for them to engage in the behaviors, than we are in trying to spend most of our measurement focus and attention on, is it related to a KPI, which is a fairly distal measure separated from where the informal learning is occurring.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you so much. Mikhail, what do you think? What does research say about measurable outcomes of informal learning? Are there any evidence-based methods that practitioners can adopt?
Sure. So I think when it comes to the measurement question, I think there's a difference between measuring whether the behavior is occurring and whether the behavior is useful. So to Scott's point, we have a 9-item scale. So if you want to figure out if people are engaging in informal learning, one of the best things you can do is ask them, right? So if you want to figure out how well they're performing, you can ask their supervisor, right? So every instance has an appropriate measurement tool. And so it's easy to figure out to some extent whether or not people are engaging in these behaviors by just asking them, are they doing these things? And so Scott mentioned a number of them already. So the way we think about informal learning oftentimes is, are you engaging in things like feedback and self-reflection? Are you engaging in vicarious learning by observing others? And are you experimenting and seeking out new learning opportunities? So when it comes to the performance side of things or the outcome side of things, Chris Sarasoli and colleagues did a meta-analysis back in 2018. And a meta-analysis, for those unfamiliar, is basically a methodological, an empirical review of empirical studies. So instead of looking at one study, you get to look at a variety of studies, so you get a better sense of what the real effects are. And what they found is that generally informal learning behaviors are associated positively with affective outcomes, so how people are feeling, so how people are thinking, cognitive outcomes, and performance as well. And I think one of the things we often overlook is that in addition to our KPIs and making sure that we have our positive performance relationships, there are a lot of other benefits that come from it as well. So if we're getting greater satisfaction, engagement, improved attitudes, all of that is an added kind of bonus in addition to all of the performance benefits. From a cognition side of things, how people think changes too. So to the extent that people engage in these informal learning behaviors, we're also seeing benefits from them acquiring new skills and abilities and knowledge. Now, the question is, how much control do you want to give these people? And are those knowledge and skills the relevant knowledge and skills for the organization? And I think there's a little bit of murkiness around that, but generally, we are seeing that there are ways to measure it, but it takes getting clever. So can we really get a good sense of what that person's baseline was, figure out how to isolate that window where that behavior occurs, and then look at their performance afterwards? So you can get at it, but to Scott's point, it's not as clear as, setting those learning objectives, having them take a test right after they have the training and seeing if later that knowledge transfers.
And Mikhail, if I can just add on to that, the type of design that you were describing there at the end, I think is really useful when we're trying to explore things from kind of a scholarly perspective, right? So to understand the variables at play. But it's a difficult one to scale, right, on
Absolutely.
a practical basis to cover large groups of employees, which is why I think the focus on the behaviors and the conditions tends to be so useful from just a pure practice lens.
Absolutely. And I think that this is really where I think this is kind of the idea behind these debates. From what I understand, Roman, there's value in knowing what the science says and then applying it in a way that's actually relevant to the organization. And so if we can consistently demonstrate that these behaviors are advantageous, we can kind of skip that part moving forward and say, do we have the kind of climate where we know this occurs? So let's measure that climate, because we can change the climate. It's hard to change the people. It's hard to change the KPIs we're interested in. So let's control the thing we actually have more control over.
And I can't help asking, Mikhail, do you agree that not everything can and should be measured as a scholar?
Over time, no. In the moment, yes. So I know Scott's also a big sports fan, and so to me, I always think of these things. I think of a lot of things in terms of sports, and I think of it in terms of these intangibles. Over time, the intangibles become a lot more tangible, and so a lot of things that we don't know how to measure now, we might figure out how to measure later. But it's also about ROI. So there are things that we don't need to measure because we know that relationship is there. And once we control for enough of the alternative explanations, we can feel pretty comfortable about the advice that we're giving.
And we also touched a little right now about the scalability, right? About this potential scalability on informal learning. We had some questions about that too. Indeed, one thing is to implement informal learning in a small team. But what about implementing it throughout the whole organization, especially if it's a big one? How to preserve its consistency and effectiveness across different functions and learning needs within the organization, where some are newcomers, some are seasoned experts, some are motivated to learn, and others just don't care. Should we personalize or standardize informal learning in the organization then? And if we do, if we make these interventions, will it still be informal learning? Maybe Mikhail, maybe you would like to answer first?
Sure. So I would argue that, so whether it's formal or informal is largely a semantic point. So when we think about informal learning, we can think about it in terms of three different dimensions. So one is it formal or is it informal? So formal learning is more about what is the purpose of the environment you find yourself in. So if you are in a classroom, the explicit purpose of that is to learn. We can think about who's driving that learning. Is it self-directed? Are you the one in charge of the learning process and the learning impetus for that learning, or is it somebody else? And then is it intentional or accidental? A lot of learning happens as a result of mistakes, but it's really difficult to capitalize on that. And depending on the environment, we may really not necessarily want that to be occurring in the first place. In terms of how do we standardize this, I think it's really more of kind of a broader question of should it be occurring in general and where should it be occurring? So if it's a compliance question and we've got the HR folks and the legal folks involved, there are certain things we probably do not want people making up on their own. There are other process things that may be valuable, and really finding those boundaries around where those are appropriate behaviors can be advantageous. You mentioned needs analysis. I don't want to steal Scott's thunder. I feel like that's probably an area that he's going to tap into in a minute here. But I think, again, one of the best things that we can do from an organizational standpoint is create the structure about where it can and cannot occur, rather than trying to focus on which specific behaviors should occur.
Scott, what do you think about that?
Well, first of all, I love that Mikhail said the distinction in some ways between informal and formal learning is somewhat semantic. Because from a research perspective, like it's really important to define things and put them in boxes and review them in a certain way. But from a practical perspective, it's a blurred line. Right. So I think it's great to acknowledge that. I will say that informal learning is inherently personalized. It's inherently personalized. And you could look at that as a bug or a feature. I tend to think of it more as a feature than as a bug. Right? If the three of us are working, even if we're working in the same area, you might have different learning needs than I have, than Mikhail has. And we're each getting exposure to different opportunities. You may interact with some different people than I do. You may have a deeper connection with some people than I do. You may be getting feedback from somebody that I'm not getting feedback from. So it's inherently personalized, right? And I would say if we pay no attention to it and provide no guidance, we shouldn't expect any consistency. It's like you get what you get. On the other hand, I don't think we should try to fully standardize it, right? So kind of there's this middle ground where we can provide some guidance and we can create a little bit greater consistency. But I want to do that in a way that doesn't lose the personally customized nature of it, that's fit for purpose around it. So I'm going to say we can provide a little bit of structure in three ways. I mean, one thing we can do is we can prime employees so that they're a little bit more attuned to what the opportunities are. So if each of us, the three of us, are working in an area and saying, look, in your area, these types of things that pop up a lot, be alert when they happen. There's some really cool opportunities here. And here's some folks that have expertise. If you get to work with them, here's some questions you might ask them, et cetera, right? And then secondly is we can boost our skills. I mean, one thing that we've seen in our work is that there are a few people who are inherently great informal learners. You could drop them in any place and they learn, but they're the exceptions, not the rule. So if we can boost the skills, and Mikhail, I think you alluded to this earlier, right? If we can improve their questioning skills, their observing skills, their mindset, then regardless of where we put them, they get more out of it. And lastly, from the back to the context thing, we know that leaders play a key role in this. So can we train them to kind of create the right conditions and promote informal learning effect? And if we do that, we get a little greater consistency, but I don't want to over-engineer the heck out of this. Otherwise, we lose the benefits of informal learning.
Yeah, I think actually, I love the idea of focusing on the skills, because oftentimes we focus on abilities. It's easy. We can get your IQ. We can do all sorts of testing ahead of time. But the difficult thing with abilities is that they're slow moving, whereas skills can be taught. And I think when we pair this with that focus on the behaviors themselves, then it really promotes that opportunity where you can actually make those tangible changes.
Okay, let's try to explore even more different question. Rather than if it's not only a big organization, but if it's a decentralized organization, is it possible and is it advisable to implement informal learning in decentralized organizations where workers are spread across different locations and meet only or mostly online? So can this online setting be effective for informal learning? Scott, maybe you can jump in on it.
So here's where this blurring of informal and more structured learning comes into play. What I will say is that in decentralized settings, whether that's fully remote work or hybrid work, there may be less naturally occurring opportunities for informal learning to occur. So if you don't focus attention on it and you don't provide some guidance and structure to it, you're likely to get less informal learning occurring. The COVID pandemic provided kind of an unfortunate learning opportunity. As people were forced to work remotely, you didn't have to work before. And Microsoft has this great set of data because they've got Microsoft Teams and they're able to look at the patterns of this. And, one of the things that breaks down most when people are in a decentralized working remotely context is kind of the loose ties that we have, right? So if Mikhail and I work together every day, shoulder to shoulder, and we start working remotely, we're still going to interact a lot. But if only occasionally I bumped into you, Roman, and now all of a sudden we're working remotely, I'm less likely to interact with you. So I think we have to provide a little bit more structure to promote informal learning, to create a context of informal learning in decentralized organizations. But I do believe we can increase it by priming people and by setting things up in a way that they're more aware of the opportunities that exist.
So it is more challenging than having them all in one office, right?
I believe so. I think it requires a little more attention because you get less of the spontaneous water cooler type of thing that happens in live settings, in real life settings.
Mm-hmm. Mikhail, what do you think? What science thinks?
I think there's COVID has been fascinating in this regard because it has pushed so many organizations to deal with kind of the virtual question. Some companies were prepared for it and were doing it ahead of time. Some had to pivot. And you see some work in the virtual team space that kind of alludes to these issues that Scott's talking about, where we don't have these interactions. So having these social connections happen, especially early on, so you can establish these routines and establish these relationships becomes critical. I think that focus on the behaviors is really interesting. In particular, when we think about how informal learning, there's this kind of big, broad bucket of informal learning, but there's different sets of behaviors in it. And what we've seen in some of our work is that we can measure informal learning writ large. And we can ask people, to what extent do you engage in things like seeking feedback? To what extent do you observe others? To what extent do you engage in experimentation? And these behaviors tend to be highly correlated. So someone who engages in a lot of experimentation often engages in a lot of observation and a lot of seeking feedback. But what's interesting is that while these behaviors kind of tend to go together really closely, they don't always have the same relationships with performance. So while informal learning on its own is generally good, what we find is that, let's say you have an environment that is psychologically safe. So Amy Edmondson over at Harvard has this construct of psychological safety, which essentially captures, is this environment safe for interpersonal risk-taking? So if I make mistakes, are they going to be held against me? And so in some of the work we've done in the healthcare space, they have an analog to this called a punitive or non-punitive climate. And when we think about some of these behaviors, generally the context starts to matter quite a bit. And so if we have a non-punitive climate and people are engaging in things like experimentation, that's not necessarily so bad, because if you're making mistakes, which is natural in an experimentation kind of setting, they're not going to be held against you. So you're actually seeing these benefits in terms of performance. And so some of these behaviors are more or less likely to manifest in a distributed virtual setting. So to Scott's point, it's hard for us to have this kind of serendipity that is required for vicarious learning to occur. It's difficult for me to observe how Scott deals with a client if I have to set up a Zoom call ahead of time and I don't know if he's going to be talking to a client at that moment. So some of these become a little bit more challenging and take a little bit more forethought to have occur. So you're kind of limited potentially in terms of which behaviors will be happening on their own and which ones might need a little bit of a nudge, if they're even appropriate at all.
It's interesting that you both mentioned COVID positively in your... It actually resonates with me because in 2021 or 22, I created a list of like 20 things that I'm grateful COVID for. It's a huge challenge, but it feels that, as you said about mistakes, as an opportunity to learn, some crises or challenges also are a great opportunity for informal learning too, right? Can we, or should we, or as organizations, should we somehow facilitate this learning during a crisis, or should we just focus on solving the problem? Are there any opportunities for that during the crisis at all?
I will say, the researcher hat in me would use a term like quasi-experiment. But from a real practical perspective, every time the system gets perturbed, right, from one of my clients, we have to deal with the problem, but it also creates a learning opportunity around it. And sometimes if we're in a place where it's crisis after crisis, we don't do the pause to learn from it. And I think the key is, do we stop, pause, and reflect from some of these smaller, bigger, whatever perturbances and take some insights from it? And so, Mikhail and I talk about COVID. That's one of those perturbances that we would have been happy to do without. But since it occurred, what can we learn from it?
Exactly. And I think this is kind of speaks to also the broader question of what is it that you actually have control over. So if you're an organization that has fostered the right kind of climates that can promote these kind of behaviors, if you're an organization that focuses on things like resilience, if you are an organization that hires people that are flexible and proactive and are interested in learning in the first place, the likelihood that you can make lemonade out of these lemons is going to be higher. And so while, to Scott's point, and I agree, I don't think we want to be rooting for more of these. If you've got the right systems in place and you have the right people in place, you're more likely to find that silver lining in these situations.
Okay, now we have talked about positive side of COVID. Let's talk about potential negative side of this beautiful informal learning that we have just discussed. Some organizations worry about possible risks and some downsides associated with it. Not only these employees plotting against the organization, but for example, we received this comment: I work in an aerospace firm where precision and compliance are everything. Informal learning often feels like a risk. It's harder to document, audit, or verify. How do you reconcile the unpredictability of informal learning with industries that demand rigorous accountability? So, making it a little more general, what are potential risks or side effects of heavy emphasis or presence of informal learning?
I'd start by saying, whether you emphasize informal learning or not, it's going to happen. Mm-hmm. It's going to happen every darn day. And if you do nothing to support it, you get what you get. So it merits some attention. But if I need to ensure that every employee can do an important task in a consistent way, I cannot rely strictly on informal learning. If I want new healthcare professionals to have a baseline standard for performing a medical procedure, I'm going to train them. I'm not going to rely on informal learning. I need the baseline consistency. So that question that you got in part is like, gee, we have a chunk of these things need to happen. Can we have informal learning do that? My answer is, if you're relying strictly on informal learning there, you're putting yourself at risk. But I also know that I can't teach, in this example with the medical professionals, I can't teach them every possible use case. I can't teach them every possible nuance. I can't expose them to every challenge that might happen. So I have to ensure they continue to learn from their experiences. In this case, that's where the informal learning comes into place. So I think it's not an or question. It's a question of how we have the mix. And what I would say is, too often, I think the strategy that comes into play, I would describe it as train and hope. Like, we train and hope that they pick up the nuances and they handle the challenges and the emergent stuff that we didn't think about. And I would like to say, in these cases, I want to train and I want to provide a little bit of the guidance and structure and build the skills and capabilities and the attunement so they can take what they learned as a baseline and extend their knowledge through informal learning.
Mikhail, any thoughts on it?
Yeah, so I think I completely agree. I think there are times where it is and is not appropriate, and when we think about standardization, it's difficult to do so, especially because it is such a deeply personal thing. What you choose to learn and how you choose to learn it and who you choose to learn it from or alongside is going to change what you learn. And if you are looking for compliance, if you are looking for consistency, I don't think informal learning is the way to get there. To Scott's point, I think having that baseline established with formal training, especially in settings like aerospace or healthcare, where we want that standardization, where maybe some best practices already exist, I think can be really helpful. And then, there's other nuances in play. So again, we talked a little bit about what is the climate like or what is the culture like. So kind of going back to the healthcare example, we did a study in a healthcare setting in a large healthcare system, and we looked at a variety of different units with a variety of employees. We had surgeons, anesthesiologists, we had people working in the food court, we even had a chaplain in there. So as you can imagine, a wide range of individuals, even within a single setting. And when you think about when is it good and when is it bad, what that climate is like can really make a huge difference. So the same behaviors, engaging in these informal learning behaviors in those units where people feel psychologically safe, is advantageous. engaging in those behaviors in a psychologically unsafe unit or in a punitive climate is detrimental. We're talking about someone who used to be a 5 out of 5 on performance dropping to a 3 out of 5. And largely, if we go back and think about what is likely to occur there, it's, well, if you're going to be experimenting, if you're going to be doing things like vicarious learning, some of these things don't look like what we typically think of as behaviors that lead to performance in a climate that's not encouraging of these kinds of behaviors. The other thing is, I've got a PhD student who's working on a project right now where we're looking at curvilinear relationships. So when we think about learning in general, we think about learning as having learning curves where there's diminishing returns. The extreme version of that is maybe there's an area where too much informal learning can actually be disadvantageous. So if we're investing so much in this that we're scrapping other endeavors, whether that's coming at the cost of getting our tasks done or ignoring formal regulations, at some point there probably is a tipping point where these things can start to go awry.
Okay, and I can listen for you for hours, for both of you, but we need to closely wrap up, and I would like to ask you just a short question before we come to close up. What is your advice for leaders who are eager to support or foster informal learning in their teams or in their organizations? Just one biggest thing that they need to keep in mind.
So Scott and I actually have a framework for this, and I think it offers kind of a nice toolkit to do so. So maybe it won't be one thing, it'll be 5 things as part of 2 things. So I think when it comes to informal learning, I think it's largely a question of readiness. Is the person ready and is the environment ready? And so when we think about the personal readiness, we can think about things. We have this framework, it's called the CAMOS framework. So does the person have capability? Do they know what they're doing? Are they aware of the learning opportunities? So that's the A. And then the M is, are they motivated? So is this person capable, aware, and motivated to engage in learning? And then do they have an environment where they can actually do so? So it comes down to opportunity. So what is that environment like? Are there learning opportunities abundant in the environment occurring naturally? Is there slack in resources? Can they take on a more kind of constructive role in engaging with that environment, and ultimately support? So when it comes to leaders, and I think this is a key piece, you can't always control the person. What you can do is you can control the climate, and you can work actively at fostering a supportive climate, whether that's at the organizational level, at the team level, if you're kind of a middle manager position. And really, I think it's a confluence of those 5 factors. As for the actual recommendations, I'll kick it over to Scott, and I'll pop back in if need be.
So it's difficult to narrow it down to one thing. I mean, you're talking to folks that are deeply engaged in this topic. I'd give you a list of 20, but I'll try and zoom in a little bit. At a high level, I want to tell leaders, approach this with what I would describe as soft touch intentionality, right? This isn't just chaos. This isn't just let things happen where they are, but don't over-engineer things, right? If you over-engineer things, you lose a little bit of the magic around it. But provide some guidance, provide some guardrails. Don't provide handcuffs. This isn't like, you can't do anything around this, but guide employees towards opportunities and boost their skills. And if I were to take then kind of one very tactical thing, I would say encourage the use of debriefing in your organization, because we learn more from experience when we reflect on it. And I can debrief on my own about an experience I had, or I can huddle up with my colleagues and we can debrief an experience. And it's a very simple technique that provides a little bit of structure without sucking all the magic out of the process. So I would say encourage a little more debriefing in your organizations.
Thank you so much. It's really inspiring. So, to wrap it up, I'd like to hear your reflections after our discussion today. Mikhail, what key insights have you taken away from today's discussion, and how will this conversation contribute to your work?
Yeah, I really like a couple of things that Scott said, kind of one early on and then one at the end there. I like the idea of really focusing on the behaviors, because I think that is something that we can easily measure, and that is something that we can easily encourage. Whereas some of these relationships that take a lot longer to do, there's always a practical question as a researcher, especially if you like to do field research, of how do you actually get organizations to say yes? And if I'm telling an organization, hey, I think this is going to be good for you, I'm going to need you to give me your performance, then we're going to have to wait 12 months, and then we'll do a survey, and then 18 months later, I need you to give me your performance again. That's not terribly appetizing, I imagine, for most organizations to give someone an 18-month window to get an answer to what they think is a simple question. So I think this idea of coming in and actually tackling the behaviors is really helpful. And the other one I like is my family's full of engineers, so I love the term "don't over-engineer things," because I do think this is one of those things where if you start to strip away the informal part of informal learning, you're right back to where we started with formal training and development. And that's not to take anything away from formal training and development, but informal learning is so individual-centric and it is driven by that person. Let's control the things we can control. Let's control the environment. And let's encourage people to engage in those behaviors rather than telling them this is exactly what you need to do, where you need to do it, when and how.
Thank you so much. What about you, Scott? What stood out most during this conversation, and how are you going to use it in your work?
I'm going to tap into a former TV show, and I'm going to say my takeaway is curb my enthusiasm. So, and by that I mean, I get excited about informal learning, and I see cool opportunities there, and it's dynamic and it's interesting, and we can structure it. But I also am reminded by our conversation today is that sometimes you need consistency, and sometimes you need baseline, and sometimes you need people to be able to do the same thing or talk the same language. And to expect informal learning to do that may be an unrealistic expectation. So it's like, I don't want to take away from the importance of formal learning. At the same time, I'm excited about informal learning. So I'm going to leave with curb my enthusiasm is kind of my takeaway from today.
My biggest takeaway probably is first, I have a lot of notes. That's a very good sign usually. But the biggest thing that somehow resonated with me is what Scott said about that informal learning happens whether we want it or not, right? Whether we channel it or not. And I probably need to think about how I can be more intentional about mine. And if there is a way for me to to ask for support that I may need, to provide this support that I may benefit from. It was really good. Thank you so much. I would ask everyone who is looking this video, please share your thoughts in the comments. We'd like to know, what did you like? What would you like to have more? What questions are the most pressing for you now? We will do our best to address them. Also, please feel free to reach out to Scott and Mikhail directly and benefit from their unique expertise. I'm glad our debates today were bloodless. It seems that scholars and practitioners are on the same page, at least on this topic. But in the next episodes, we will find out if it's the case in other domains too. So Scott and Mikhail, thank you again for joining us and sharing your thoughts. It was really, really interesting.
Thanks, Roman. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you.